everyone, welcome to Leading with Agility, the show that uses the world around us to explore how leadership can be inspired by agility. I'm your host, Arif, and I'm joined today by...
Myself, TK, the thought-provoking troublemaker.
Thank you, TK, and thank you for all of you for joining us today. So today's episode, well, with a lot going on around us in the world today.
Always is.
There always is. And what's been bugging me, or what's been in my mind, I suppose, and something I've been thinking about and wondering how to kind of put this together into a podcast episode. Recent news, if you've been following the financial world, I suppose, has been the news that sales of both McDonald's and Starbucks have been affected in certain parts of the world, mainly due to boycotts for various reasons, primarily due to the events in the Middle East. And I was thinking about that from a leadership and organizational perspective.
There's plenty there, yes.
Yeah, and I thought there's a lot we can unpack in that and think about and talk about. And there's two issues, TK, that I want to touch on in today's episode.
Yeah.
Number one is obviously how should organizations and leaders respond to boycotts? And then a difficult one, yeah. And an aside to that, slightly different but related issue is then how should leaders more broadly confront and talk about challenging societal issues, whether that's internally with employees and their staff, or perhaps how they take public stances and what they say and do.
And I'm guessing that many organizations and leaders, when they're hearing this, are probably getting goosebumps.
Yeah.
Because this is something that many people are uncomfortable talking about.
Exactly.
But not us with this podcast.
Too right. I think we should take the time to, thoughtfully and, in a, I hope, thought-provoking, to use your moniker, TK, but also in a way that's contextualizing as much as possible, but giving you practical ideas and tips as we always do. Finally, more importantly, bringing it all under the umbrella of agile leadership, and how does that all sit with these kind of challenges we're talking about?
Absolutely.
So, with that in mind, let's get started with the boycott element, right? To start with that, and I was trying to do some reading and research, as I always do before recording an episode, thinking about how should leaders deal with boycotts? I don't think we're going to touch or go into the boycotts themselves. It's not relevant for this podcast, but it's
There's plenty of podcasts going there.
Yeah, exactly.
You can subscribe to them.
You can, I'm sure you can. But it's more about how to deal with it from a leadership point of view, from an organizational point of view, and how should organizations respond. And I've got some stuff that I've been looking at, but before we do that, I don't know, TK, what do you want to say at the outset, if anything?
I would say that you have to deal with it first and not ignore it. I think this is the first principle. Although one of the strategies that I've seen is sounding like or looking like ignoring it, but it's actually making a conscious decision to remain at the status quo. But I'll let you cue it in.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. Well, and so a nice cue, the segue there, which is I found this 2011 article from the Journal of Management and Organization, where two academics put together a model for how they think organizations can deal with boycotts. And without going into the full extent and the detail of it all, they came up with a model which is basically a 4x4 matrix of how they think organizations should deal with boycotts.
Must be an American organization. They love their 4x4 matrices.
They love 4x4. Well, I don't know if one is an American academic. The other one is from a Gulf Arab country.
There you go.
So doesn't really matter, but yeah.
No.
maybe they've worked at a consultancy before. Who knows? Let's not go there. Let's not go there. Right. So the model they took is a 4x4, and on the one hand you've got what they call brand country association. On the other side, you've got boycott intensity. And the argument is essentially a lot of these boycotts of brands, organizations, hinge on this idea of the brand or the organization being linked to the country of origin, or they call it COO. And when a boycott happens, typically there is some, the momentum, the mood of the people who are involved in that boycott are looking at that country of origin kind of link and making the judgment call as to whether or not that company or brand should be boycotted.
Good point, but doesn't have to be a country of origin, although we're using this as an example.
Sure.
For instance, we had a thing in Britain that you might remember called Brexit.
Oh, yes.
And I remember people's stance, like, Dyson or Wetherspoons. And I'm not that I'm boycotting them, although I don't have a Dyson device.
Yeah. Yes. Well, there you go. That's interesting. Exactly. So their boxes is 4 kind of dimensions. Let's just quickly go through them of how they think organizations should deal with boycotts. So the first thing you're talking about is if you're in a high intensity boycott environment where there's a strong mood, a strong momentum to boycott an organization, a brand, then you've got 2 things you've got to consider. Are those people who are boycotting making a strong association with your brand or your company to a country of origin? If that's the case, then you've got to do something they call blend in. And but what they say is you should assume the local character of the company and downplay your own foreign identity. I find that quite interesting as an approach. It's basically it's as if you're trying to say we're not associated with those other people that you're boycotting. We're completely different. We're from this local region, or we're from the local country, or whatever it is. We have no association to that other country. It's nothing to do with us. And we can do this through marketing or advertising or whatever.
You can push any marketing, let's say, narrative in through marketing, but this sounds terribly incongruent and unnatural, exactly. I think, right? Yeah. Because, sometimes the country's name is even in your company name, right. And trying to distance yourself from it, it's probably not the right thing to do. I would probably use a different strategy, right. Which is maybe being more empathetic towards the country and showing your links. Maybe, you've been at a country for decades, right? Show it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I mean, and on that point, you've got companies, well-known brands like IKEA or IKEA. Mm-hmm. The colours of their company are the colours of their country of origin. Blue and yellow. So
and actually also really culturally associated with them,
exactly.
Right?
It's completely
can't
embedded.
Imagine IKEA just making an impression that they're Spanish or Italian.
Right.
It's just completely not the vibe.
No, it's not exactly. So anyway, I don't want to go into the too much of this, but and look, if you're interested, as we always do, we provide links to things we talk about. So in the episode description, you'll find a link to this model and you can look through it. But what struck me was exactly what you're talking about, TK, was blending in, or the other side of this matrix, they talk about lowering your profile. So, if you're in a situation where the association with your country of origin for that company or brand is low, but again, there is a high intensity boycott taking place, just lower your profile. Don't talk too much about who you are, your company, etc. And I think, all of this, I just found it very incongruent. It didn't feel genuine. It didn't feel authentic, and it just made me think, no, there's got to be a better way. Are these the appropriate ways to handle a company facing a boycott?
Many of our listeners will probably remember the foreshadowing that you just gave us, which is like it's a 4 quadrants, so there's other 2 quadrants. But when it comes to keeping a lower profile, I think personally, there's other strategies, but this one is quite reasonable, not to antagonize the situation, right? You are in there, so at least you have the decency to keep the low profile. I mean, decency in the eyes of people boycotting you. Sometimes it even helps. I've seen this strategy used a lot.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think the other questions that it raised for me going through this was, how do you address actual customer pain here, or consumer pain, consumer needs? There is something here. linking it back to agility and the type of agile leadership we talk about, where we're advocating the idea of continuous improvement and reflecting and that kind of stuff. Then part of that is, well, you've got to reflect on something's happening for your consumers. They are not happy about something. So, are you really addressing that, or you're just avoiding the issue?
Well, all right, but there is another side of looking at it, which is if, for instance, you are from a country of origin and you're so strongly supporting a course of action, politically, ideologically, whatever it is, you might find that the needs of your base community, of your home community, of your whole country, and their point of view outweighs your consumers in a foreign country that you sell into. Obviously, if you're a leader in this foreign country, you are impacted.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to figure out where your loyalties lie and what are your values there.
Yeah. No. And so a good point. And I think beyond that, then there is some questions around, as you said, loyalties, but also just what role should leaders play when this is happening. And I wanted to give some examples, or one particular example. Okay, I should say, caveat, this is a US context here, but I think it's still quite indicative of this wider challenge. So we've had when the previous president was in power, Mr. Trump, in 2017, he announced a travel ban affecting certain countries around the world because he has his own beliefs as to those particular countries and people from them. And what was really interesting was it affected the discourse, especially in America, around from a business point of view, at least. When certain companies stayed silent about the decision of the American president at the time, other countries were quite vocal. So there was like this two kind of sided kind of response to his decision. And I think it spoke, and now I'm looking at it and thinking back on it, it spoke to a really challenging and difficult situation business leaders can find themselves in. Do they take a stand? Do they speak up? Do they remain silent? And sometimes silence can be considered as complicity. And so the example, just to finish this off, the example, and then we can debate it, TK, was you had tech CEOs effectively vocally talking about this ban being harmful, not being conducive to a business environment. It was effectively stopping them from hiring talent from around the world. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you had companies like Uber who stayed silent, even though this would have affected a lot of them. They don't have employees, but self-employed drivers that they have, right? Because they come from those countries generally, and they are generally immigrants as well. So they stay silent, and that resulted in a large-scale boycott. A lot of people decided to boycott Uber because they remained silent on that ban. So it's really interesting to see the two sides of that reaction.
Well, there's another side, which is what if the leaders in Uber or their top board were actually, and I know it might sound strange for a person having particular views, but what if they supported the ban? What if they were very close to Donald J. And maybe there were political ties, and maybe they genuinely believed in it. Yes. And in this case, like some would say, you say that they being silent are culprits, but maybe them being silent is actually moderating themselves from not speaking an opinion that would be widely considered unpopular. I'm not valuing right or wrong. Yes. We don't know.
Yes.
But that's the people have values, people have opinions, people have beliefs. Yeah. And, as a leader, I don't think you can disassociate yourself from them. Now, the question is what happens when your beliefs are conflicting with your employees, the people you serve, or what if they are conflicted with the market? This is an interesting
And we're going to talk
question.
about that. We're going to talk about that. It's really interesting. We're going to come to that. And you made some really important points there, TK, around, the vocalness, if I can say, of one's beliefs, isn't it? And so on that point, I found a really interesting comment by the author Judy Samuelson, who has written some books on leadership, I believe. And she said, I'll read some of it verbatim because I thought it was quite interesting. She says, the challenge today for all corporations is clear. Citizens are looking for leadership on issues of real consequence. These issues are no longer confined to the ballot box, and consumers are aligning their dollars with their ideals. I'm sure we can replace dollars with any other currency you use. The answer for businesses, she continues, may require new forms of association in which courageous CEOs can stand up and be counted. A provocative quote, one might say, TK. What do you think, listening to that?
Well, it's a difficult one. I think, if you unpeel the layers, it's all about your belief of what's important, what's your leadership style in terms of communication and being congruent with your values, right? You've got, I can't remember the first name of the CEO of Ryanair or Larry.
Michael,
I think so. Well, and he is very open, and I'm sure he is very open about his thoughts, values. He's very direct. I think the airline is reasonably successful.
Yeah,
it's Michael.
It is Michael.
Some others would probably not use the language he's using.
No,
he makes it clear.
He makes it clear, and I suppose that's interesting. His stances are extremely clear, and then that gives purpose to his organization, and that's something I'm going to come on to.
Many people hate it, to be honest. I don't mind.
No, but exactly, that's my point. It internally to his organization, it gives real purpose, right? Yeah. Employees know where Michael stands.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, and then
I can only imagine what he tells them. Yeah.
Right, and then externally, consumers know where they stand with Michael, and it's like, okay, well, do I want to shop with him or not? At least I know. Buy my flights with Ryanair or not? Is it congruent with my values? And there you go. So fascinating. I think that's really fascinating. Thank you for that one, Tika. Really good. So I just since we've touched on it, let's move the conversation on a bit in terms of Judy's point there as a kind of jumping off point around, and what we've just talked about around vocalness of a senior leader, a CEO, or whatever leader you are when it comes to the stand you may need to take or should take or shouldn't take on societal issues, etc. Right? But whether or not, I think the important point for me in what she's saying is the consumer aspect and the customer aspect. I think that is the bit that many organizations are missing, or I don't know if missing is the right word, may not value as much, or they're not thinking about it actively or proactively enough. That, whatever we do or don't do has an impact. People perceive it in a certain way. So therefore we need to have, perhaps the argument is, clarity on where we stand. I think that's the issue that Judy's making.
I think definitely we need clarity as to where we stand. The question is, we should also have a clarity of action. Now, this action may not result in clear communication because this might be our intention.
No, you may not do. So we can talk about some ideas of clarity of action in a moment. But just as a bit of context for some of this stuff. So where's this all coming from? So I think one of the things to mention is this whole movement to what's called ESG. Towards ESG. So,
yes.
This stands for environmental. I always get this wrong. I can't say it. Environmental, social, and corporate governance.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. So this is, and I'm going to take a Wikipedia definition. So forgive me. A set of considerations including environmental issues, social issues, and corporate governance that can be considered in investing. Now, perhaps it is broader than just investing. I'm sure it applies. So from a perspective, as we just talked about, where you stand from a consumer point of view, from a business ethics point of view. I think there's a lot in here. I don't think it's just about investing, but yeah, ESG I think is the wider backdrop for this conversation, which is quite interesting.
Okay.
And I think going to Judy's point, we have a societal shift of, as I said, consumers and employees having higher expectations of brands and organizations, and especially now that we have our communication media landscape is so vastly different to even 10 years ago, right? You've got social media that can make or break a brand within hours, and you've got global movements that can be started around issues within like days and weeks as well. I think there's a lot that brands do need. There is a lot of pressure on them. There's a lot that they need to think about. What do you think, DK?
Well, I would say that, this, as always, providing a counterpoint, there's always so much noise, right? And there's other strategies that can be used to manage that. And there's definitely professionals doing that. There are examples of how brands dealt well with a crisis. There are some spectacular failures. You're right. People love these stories, whether successes or failures, but they also live for a short time. It's interesting that we have such a storm of information, but it's inversely proportional to our memory and how we keep things in mind.
Yeah.
So if things will move on, one of these strategies that you've quoted in terms of like just keep it quiet, it's actually exploiting this trend, right? People will move on to some other shiny things, and forgot your boycott.
Exactly, and that was one of the things I was reading, which is I read a few different pieces from not only academics but commentators who basically said, any strength of a boycott is dependent on the frictionless to boycott, I suppose. So like the friction. So they gave an example of in the States when there was the Horizon disaster of the
oil rig,
the oil rig that exploded, and that was BP, right? That was their oil rig that exploded. Many people died. Environmental disaster, etc., etc. And there was obviously a lot of okay, we need to boycott BP, right? Fine. Then again, you need gas, as you Americans would call it. They need gas. You've got 2 gas stations around the corner. The BP's cheaper. Most people ended up still going to the BP, right? It's stuff like that, which then just reduces the intensity of the boycott, and it just dies down. So if you maintain that low profile, it will blow over very quickly.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is, I'm not saying it's a uniquely US perspective, but I feel for people in the US because they definitely live their lives, if you look at their media, in a media overdrive frenzy. Completely oversaturated with things, right? When I see other countries, when things are happening socially, politically and such, okay, well, there's a lot, right? And then I, open CNN or whatever, and I can see how these poor people are really bombarded with all of this. So I don't know if I would keep up the boycott for more than a few days of anything, really.
So okay, let's move on to what we were going back to what we started with, and looking at the ESG backdrop and how leaders what stance should they take? Should they speak up? Should they not? Etc. Let's just go back to that because there was an interesting quote, or it was something interesting happened in 2018. So Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, one of the world's biggest, most famous, largest investment companies out there, he wrote a letter talking about how he envisages, how he sees leaders need to behave in this changing world. And there were a couple of things that stood out for me. So I wanted to read some of those out, and reflects what we've said, I think, already, which is, the first thing he said, employees are increasingly looking to their employer as the most trusted, competent and ethical source of information, more so than government, the media and NGOs. Fascinating. So that's his thought.
Fascinating indeed.
That's 2018, right? And then he says, the other thing he said was stakeholders don't want to hear us as CEOs opine on every issue of the day, but they do need to know where we stand on the societal issues intrinsic to our company's long-term success. So he's making the link explicitly there that, you can't operate a business in a bubble. You're not immune to what's happening outside. And whatever the music is outside amongst your consumers and not even or even employees internally, if you're not addressing that, you're not attending to that, it will affect your company's long-term success. I think that's quite a powerful statement, TK.
It is. And now it's really thought-provoking.
Yeah.
I haven't really thought about it as much. And, puts even more of a responsibility on leaders, because we talk a lot about how leaders set the culture. Now, if this is true, which seems to be, leaders will also need to have the responsibility of not only modeling the culture inside the company, but also filtering the culture outside.
Yes.
And you really need to be, know your stance, know where you stand, think what you want to do about it, and then communicate internally and externally. And also, the best way to model great culture of trust and openness is congruence. So,
yes.
Whoa, you've got a tough nut to crack there.
A very tough one. And some of those ideas that you mentioned, I want to circle back to some of that, because there's some good stuff there that I think needs breaking down a bit more. But just touching on this, and it's a challenge, isn't it? So how should leaders do what Larry's talking about, essentially? And this is, I think, going back a bit, with that ESG backdrop I talked about, that's where some of this started from, or it kind of grew a bit more, this idea of taking more responsibility and looking more broader than just your own company and how it's performing, but looking at all these other aspects. And Larry's comments, I think, snowballed a bit from that point onwards. But so let's just look at, okay, how can leaders do this? And I came across an NYU associate professor, Alison Taylor, and in a recent podcast, she was talking about some of this stuff around, these societal issues, what should leaders be doing, etc. And one thing that she said, which struck me, I thought was right down our alley when it comes to agile ways of working that we talk about, but also from a leadership point of view, and taking that agile principle is, okay, knowing where you stand first as a company. How do you do that? How do you make the case? Well, have a clear, consistent idea of yourselves as a business, as a company, as to what you believe on something and how you're going to respond to it. More importantly, how you're going to respond to what stakeholders, consumers talk about. And she described this idea of, okay, well, she believes, number one, silence is an option. That's one thing. And so the second thing, following on from that, is that you need to have a cross-functional team of people who can react and respond when some of these kind of challenges occur. So these are people that maybe come from part of your business when it comes to dealing with risk. They're comms experts. They may be HR people. They may be involved in sustainability. Other senior leaders come together, form a task force, form a cross-functional team, and figure out how to react and respond to what's happening out there. Whether it's a boycott you're facing, whether it's some other movement towards your company and your company's goals, you can't stay silent. You've got to create a team. You've got to have some testing and learning, some iterative work needs to happen to figure out what your position is going to be. I thought that was quite a fascinating approach. I don't know, TK, what your reactions to that are.
It's a bit overwhelming. Not everyone feels like they can set up a team. But I think my other thought is, when something happens externally like this, like for instance, you would think that, a situation, social, economic or political, that happens, it just happens and it might not directly impact you. So you would say that, well, I have a lot of other problems in my organization. Why should I spend my time thinking about this complex issue? And there are many complex issues in the world, and all of these social situations are always complex. There's always intricacies that you need to consider. So this is a difficult job of a leader, and as a leader, there's your responsibility to know where you actually need to look into it. Because, silence isn't an option. But then again, as you said, Arif, living in a world that's overdriven with information, there's plenty of issues happening. So how do you choose the ones that can have an impact? Yeah,
it's a good one. And I suppose, which one's impacting you as a business? Maybe. Well, I don't know if that's the right way to make the decision. That could be one approach, but I think it needs to come from within. And then she does. The other thing she talks about, I think, which is more powerful, and let's get on to that, which is, I think, looking internally first as well. So from a leadership point of view, how are you leading your own organizations through these kind of challenges? Because one thing that's coming up, and what I'm reading, and in fact, we had a chat with one of our clients the other day, and one thing they're considering also is what they call workforce polarization.
Yes.
So as society becomes more polarized generally, the worry is, okay, well, how does that affect our employees? What will happen for our employees? How do we avoid polarization occurring, where you've got extreme views on whatever side of whatever the issue is of the day? How do we create a more cohesive, coherent, workforce, et cetera, et cetera? So there's a lot of work for leaders here. And I think let's just talk about that from a leadership point of view rather than broadly just organizationally, right? And I was reading some stuff. There's a non-profit organization called More in Common, and they do a lot of work in this space to unite societies, less division and stuff like that. Sounds like a great, great intent, nice ideas. And so part of the article, they've got some of their ideas in there, and I picked a few things out from a leadership point of view, which really struck, I think, to me, what we talk about when it comes to agile leadership. And I thought, let's just go through some of these things. So the first one, I think, was really straightforward, but it's about listening to your employees to better understand their backgrounds, interests, values. So, I mean, it's nothing earth-shattering. We've mentioned this on a previous podcast, I'm sure, but there is something here around, don't sit in a bubble. Don't sit there thinking things will go away. You need to have conversations with your employees, or at least start listening to them and be genuine when it comes to listening. What are their concerns?
I think it's earth-shattering, Arif, because many organizations have a policy that some topics are taboo. We shouldn't discuss politics. We shouldn't discuss our views. Religion, other world views. But if you're supposed to listen, you're supposed to listen to these things.
Yeah, exactly. It should happen. And then I think what's more important, and it goes to Alison's point, is she's talking about, okay, what's your own internal position on something? So it links to this idea that leaders need to explicitly outline their company's philosophy regarding engagement on these social issues. So, and there needs to be consistency around that as well. So, you can't, I suppose, again, say one thing perhaps publicly, have a different view internally. You need to have a clear, consistent view on whatever the topic is.
I remember, and it's not only having a view, but actually taking action. Now, this is probably quite separate, but I remember a situation when my wife was working in RBS, now known as NatWest, so a British bank, and they're very heavily invested in pride and supporting LGBTQ and people and the whole culture. So, but there are some countries that they operate in which are not that friendly to these minorities. So I remember my wife telling me a story how she was driving or taking a taxi to a local headquarters of this bank in a country that wasn't that, tolerant towards this minority, and how the taxi driver was commenting on the rainbow flags. And yet they still flew the flags.
Yeah, exactly. So at least that had some consistency in their view there, right? Or in their position.
Oh yeah. They took action when it was difficult. I'm sure that there were more than these taxi drivers commenting on that in this particular region.
Related to that, there's the other kind of action or a behavior leaders can take. I thought was quite interesting was create clear rules and norms for open discussions that would encourage honest and respectful communication and even disagreement between employees. I think this is a really, really important one. The only way to avoid the polarization, reduce the kind of divisions, and perhaps start getting to that consistency of position, whatever that is you've got to bring people together. You've got to create the space where people can have the conversation and air their differences. That has to be facilitated, but it has to be led from you. You as a leader, you as a CEO, or whatever level of rank you are. I think there's responsibility on all levels here as leaders in an organization to behave in this way or bring some of this into your organization in terms of creating rules and norms.
And this is why ourselves, as humble associates, when we teach leaders, we do believe that facilitation is one of the most important tools.
Yes.
When leading, right? It's not enough to 100%. Send emails to people, but
no.
you actually need to be able to create these spaces.
Yeah. And having the facilitation skills to be able to hold forums like this, I think is beyond, I don't know, like it's like so valuable, extremely valuable.
It's necessary. I think it's one of our basic modules.
The other thing I think we talk a lot about is culture. We've mentioned it a lot, and I think it's interesting it comes up here, which is, you not only can you affect, obviously, through behaving in this way, affecting the culture of your organization, but you can also affect the culture outside of your organization. So if you're a leader, if you're a CEO, whatever it is, and you've got an ecosystem, of suppliers, customers, whatever it might be, you've got an opportunity, to influence how they're behaving as well as how your own internal staff employees are behaving when it comes to some of this.
Yeah, the bigger you are, the more influence you have. So it's only reasonable, right? Sometimes, like even the local community, if you put a big presence where you are, of course you do have the influence, which is, it's interesting. This is the whole social responsibility aspect of even ESG, where, you need to look outside too.
100%. Couldn't agree more. The final one that I thought was quite interesting also, communicate a clear purpose. Now, where have we had that before? Again, core principle when it comes to how we believe you should lead an agile team. How you should lead as an agile leader as well is to have a clear purpose for your team, know what everyone knows what they're aiming for, what their goals are, what their vision is, that North Star, as we call it, TK. But I think there's clearly something here which is bridge between internally what we want to do, but also the impact that we want to create outside in the world. And that, I think, can really help with that polarization aspect.
It means that you know what your purpose is.
Yeah.
And many organizations haven't discovered it yet.
Yeah, exactly. So what does this all mean, I suppose, as we draw towards the end of this episode? I think... I was summarizing it. I was thinking about it, and I think it's all about leaders behaving with empathy, being reflective. This is all what agile leadership is, really, isn't it, Tika? I don't know what. How would you summarize some of these things in terms of these traits or these behaviors that we've described, or these ideas that we're talking about in terms of how you can lead to avoid some of this polarization, to bring people together in from an organizational perspective, but also have clear stances on some of these wider societal issues.
Don't hide your head in the sand.
Yeah.
I think it's all about, knowing where you stand, knowing what your values are. And if you don't, that's fine. Just reflect. It's about, being able to reflect and hey, crises come and go. If you failed, maybe learn from it and improve continually.
Yeah. Definitely continually. And I think, and the last thing is, if you want to build high-performing organizations, you want to build high-performing teams, these kind of things I'm afraid to say you've got to deal with as well. So you've got to try and think about how you can embed some of these practices that we've talked about into your leadership stance so that you can get to what you're aiming for. So, yeah. Wow. Okay. A lot we've talked about, a lot we've shared today. How would we summarize our conversation more broadly, this whole episode? What would you like to say, TK, in closing?
I think this episode is a demonstration that no topics are out of bounds,
yes.
right? Even a difficult one like boycotts, like conflicts happening in the real world, need to be discussed. And I think we're doing our best to show you that they can be done in a respectful, constructive way.
Yeah.
And, we could have chosen different topics around something more simpler, something more flashy. But in Humble Associates, we believe in having real conversations about the difficult issues because they are what matters.
Amazing. I love that. That's I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. We hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, please subscribe if you haven't already, and do pass on the podcast to a friend. Maybe they'll enjoy it too. Thank you very much, and until next time, see you around.
Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.